In 1947, Europe faced a crisis unmatched in its modern history. The Second World War had ended 2 years earlier, but the continent was still in ruins, economically broken, politically unstable, and socially exhausted. Entire cities lay in rubble, factories were destroyed, railways twisted, farms abandoned, and millions of people displaced. Winter shortages threatened starvation. Coal, the essential fuel of European industry, was scarce. Inflation in several countries was spiraling uncontrollably. Democratic governance were fragile, and communist parties supported by Moscow were gaining strength in France, Italy, and other nations. The fear of another collapse, reminiscent of the 1930s, hung over Europe. It was into this dangerous vacuum that the United States stepped with a proposal that would reshape the post-war world, the Marshall Plan. To understand why the Marshall Plan emerged, it is essential to grasp the geopolitical environment of early Cold War Europe. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had already begun to fracture. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the consolidation of communist regimes, and the tightening of political control across the region alarmed American policymakers. They feared that Western Europe, physically devastated and economically desperate, might drift toward political extremism or fall under Soviet influence through democratic collapse. The future of global stability depended on preventing Western Europe from disintegrating. George C. Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State and former Army Chief of Staff, recognized that traditional diplomacy would not be enough. Europe needed more than speeches and declarations. It needed fuel, food, capital, equipment, and stable currencies. In June 1947, speaking at Harvard University, Marshall proposed a bold idea. The United States would provide large-scale economic assistance to any European nation willing to cooperate in a joint recovery program. The proposal was revolutionary in scope. It envisioned not only emergency relief, but a long-term rebuilding effort that would revive European industry, modernize agriculture, stabilize currencies, and restore confidence in democratic institutions. The European Recovery Program, which became known as the Marshall Plan, was not simply charity. It was a strategic investment in global stability and American interests. U.S. officials believed that economic recovery in Europe would benefit the world economy and strengthen the political alignment of Western nations. If Europe collapsed, economically, American factories would lose export markets, unemployment would rise, and the post-war global order could fracture. The Marshall Plan aimed to prevent this collapse by creating a network of prosperous, stable, and friendly nations. Before aid could flow, Europe had to organize itself. This was a critical element of the plan. Marshall insisted that European nations cooperatively design their recovery needs rather than rely on unilateral American direction. For the first time, European governments, historically rivals, sat together to coordinate economic goals. 16 nations eventually joined the effort, creating the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, to manage requests and allocate resources. This cooperation marked a historic step toward European integration. American lawmakers debated the plan intensely. Critics questioned the cost, arguing that the United States could not afford to send billions overseas. Supporters countered that the cost of inaction, economic collapse, political instability, and potential conflict would be far greater. After months of political struggle, Congress approved the plan in 1948. Over the next 4 years, the United States committed more than $12 billion, equivalent to over $100 billion today. The impact was immediate. Shipments of grain, coal, machinery, trucks, medical supplies, and raw materials began arriving in European ports. American-built cranes unloaded cargo into warehouses and rail yards. Factories restarted production lines that had been silent since the war. Power stations repaired transformers. Farmers received fertilizer, tractors, and seed. At a time when hunger and cold threatened millions, these shipments provided essential relief and restored hope. One of the most important features of the Marshall Plan was its emphasis on modernization rather than simply reconstruction. Aid was directed toward upgrading industrial technology, improving transportation networks, and encouraging productivity. European factories modernized equipment, adopting American production techniques that increased efficiency. The plan supported currency stabilization, allowing nations to control inflation and restore trade. Technical assistance programs sent European managers, engineers, and workers to the United States to study industrial methods. They returned home with new knowledge that transformed manufacturing, agriculture, and energy production. The Marshall Plan also helped revive confidence in democratic governance. Economic hardship had always been fertile ground for political extremism. By stabilizing food supplies, curbing inflation, and restoring employment, the plan strengthened centrist political forces and reduced the influence of communist parties in Western Europe. The United States presented itself not only as a source of economic aid, but as a partner in building a stable, prosperous, democratic world. This soft power became a critical asset during the early Cold War. For the Soviet Union, the Marshall Plan was seen as a threat. Moscow denounced the program as an instrument of American influence and forbade Eastern European nations under its control from participating. Countries such as Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia initially showed interest, recognizing the benefits, but were pressured to withdraw. This divide hardened the political split between Eastern and Western Europe, creating the economic and ideological boundary that would define the Cold War. The Marshall Plan did not cause this divide, but it cemented the Western Bloc's alignment with the United States. By the end of the first year, the effect on European morale was unmistakable. Production increased, food shortages eased, and currencies stabilized. The psychological impact was as important as the economic one. Europeans began to believe that recovery was possible. Investors regained confidence. Governments planned long-term development rather than short-term survival. American credibility strengthened as European nations saw results rather than promises. As the program expanded, its effects rippled through global trade. American agriculture fed millions, and U.S. industries produced machinery and supplies that supported reconstruction. Factories in the Midwest built locomotives for France, steel mills in Pennsylvania, shipped materials for rebuilding bridges in Belgium. Iowa grain-fed cities in Italy. The Marshall Plan tied the European economy to the American economy in ways that would shape transatlantic relations for decades. By 1949, the program had already transformed Europe's trajectory, but the most significant phase through economic revival was still ahead. By 1949, the Marshall Plan had moved beyond emergency relief and entered its most transformative phase, rebuilding European industry on a scale that would restore long-term economic stability. The initial shipments of food and coal had stabilized daily life, but true recovery required restoring production, reconstructing infrastructure, and modernizing entire national economies. This phase of the Marshall Plan shifted its focus from immediate survival to sustainable growth, reviving factories, re-establishing trade networks, and enabling Western Europe to stand on its own feet. One of the most critical achievements of this period was the revival of industrial output. Factories in France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and other nations received new machinery purchased with Marshall Plan funds. Many of these factories had been damaged by bombing, stripped by occupying forces, or left idle due to lack of fuel and raw materials. American equipment, from precision machine tools to turbines and electrical generators, allowed Europe to adopt modern manufacturing techniques. This modernization increased productivity dramatically. Factories not only returned to pre-war output levels but surpassed them in several countries by the early 1950s. Transportation networks, essential for economic integration, also benefited heavily. Roads and bridges destroyed during the war were rebuilt with steel, cement, and construction materials provided through the plan. Railways, which had been targeted relentlessly by Allied bombers in the final stages of the war, were repaired and expanded. Locomotives and freight cars purchased with Marshall Plan dollars restored Europe's ability to move goods efficiently. Ports were dredged, warehouses rebuilt, and cranes installed to increase cargo capacity. These improvements reduced transportation costs, stimulated trade, and encouraged regional economic cooperation. Agriculture, devastated by years of conflict, experienced a parallel transformation. European farms had suffered from labor shortages, equipment losses, and soil exhaustion. The Marshall Plan supplied tractors, fertilizers, livestock feed, seeds, and modern agricultural machinery. American fertilizers and hybrid crops increased yields substantially, helping Europe reduce its dependence on imported grain. As agricultural production recovered, food shortages diminished, and rural communities regained stability. The return of food security removed one of the major threats to political and social stability. A key component of the Marshall Plan was the introduction of counterpart funds. When the United States sent goods to Europe, the receiving governments sold those goods within their domestic markets. The local currency generated from these sales was then deposited into special government accounts, counterpart funds, that could be used for domestic reconstruction projects. This mechanism multiplied the impact of American aid. Instead of simply injecting foreign goods, the plan created pools of local capital that financed new housing, factories, power plants, and infrastructure projects. These funds gave European governments the resources needed to invest in long-term national development. Currency stabilization was another fundamental achievement. The chaotic monetary systems left behind by the war had disrupted trade and undermined confidence in governments. Inflation plagued several countries, eroding savings and destabilizing markets. The Marshall Plan supported financial reforms that restored currency stability. In West Germany, for example, the 1948 currency reform replaced the worthless Reichsmark with the Deutschmark, helping launch what would later become known as the economic miracle. Stable currencies encouraged savings, investment, and cross-border trade, forming the basis for long-term prosperity. Perhaps the most important but often overlooked feature of the Marshall Plan was the encouragement of European cooperation. For centuries, European nations had viewed each other primarily as rivals. The Marshall Plan pushed them to collaborate by requiring joint planning and coordination. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, created to administer the plan, forced governments to share economic data, harmonize production goals, and allocate resources collectively. This cooperation laid the foundation for later institutions such as the European Coal and Steel Community, and eventually the European Union. While these developments took decades to mature, their roots lay in the cooperative mechanisms introduced by the Marshall Plan. The plan also included a technical assistance program that sent thousands of European engineers, managers, and government officials to the United States to study American industrial practices. They visited factories, farms, government agencies, and laboratories. They learned mass production techniques, scientific management, labor relations, and modern agricultural methods. Upon returning home, they implemented these ideas in their own industries, spreading American efficiency models throughout Europe. This transfer of knowledge was as important as the financial aid itself. It helped modernize European management practices, increase productivity, and strengthen industrial competitiveness. As these reforms took hold, Soviet concerns intensified. Moscow saw the Marshall Plan as a direct challenge to its influence in Europe. By rebuilding Western economies and promoting political stability, the United States was creating a barrier to communist expansion. In response, the Soviet Union tightened control over Eastern Europe, implementing its own centralized economic structures and further isolating the East from Western markets. The result was an economic and political divide that deepened throughout the Cold War. A prosperous, market-driven Western Europe aligned with the United States, and a controlled, centrally planned Eastern Bloc under Soviet dominance in Western Europe. However, the Marshall Plan's impact was overwhelmingly positive. Industrial production soared, employment increased, public morale improved as cities rebuilt and economies stabilized. By 1950, Western Europe was moving from recovery to growth. The value of U.S. aid, though massive, represented only a portion of Europe's total investment. The true strength of the plan lay in its catalytic effect by restoring confidence, providing necessary resources, and encouraging cooperation. It unlocked Europe's ability to rebuild itself. The revival of trade was one of the clearest indicators of success. As factories returned to full operation and transportation systems improved, European nations began exporting goods again. Markets reopened. Businesses reinvested profits. Consumers returned to stores. Economic integration fueled by improved currency stability made cross-border trade increasingly common. This growing economic interdependence not only revived prosperity but also reduced the likelihood of future conflict by binding European nations together through mutual interests. By the end of the United States recognized that its investment had accomplished far more than reconstruction. It had fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape. The Marshall Plan had stabilized Western Europe, created robust economic partners, and set the stage for strong political alliances that would define the Cold War. Yet the plan still had years to run, and the next phase would push European recovery into full-scale economic expansion. By 1950, the Marshall Plan had already stabilized Western Europe, but its most powerful effects were only beginning to take hold. The continent was transitioning from fragile recovery to accelerating economic expansion. What had started as an emergency effort to prevent collapse was evolving into a comprehensive modernization program that reshaped industries, strengthened democratic governments, and bound Europe more tightly to the United States. The next phase of the Marshall Plan drove Europe beyond reconstruction into transformation. A central driver of this transformation was industrial modernization. The Marshall Plan did not merely replace what had been destroyed, it pushed Europe toward the future. Factories invested in new technologies, assembly line methods, and updated equipment purchased with American funds. In West Germany, the Ruhr industrial region, once a focal point of wartime production, was rebuilt into one of the most productive industrial centers in the world. Steel mills installed modern furnaces, energy plants upgraded turbines, and chemical factories adopted advanced processes. This modernization fueled rapid economic growth and helped launch West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. France experienced a parallel resurgence. Marshall Plan grants supported the Monet Plan, an ambitious national program designed to increase production of coal, steel, cement, electricity, and transport. The result was a dramatic rise in industrial output. French factories produced goods at greater speed and volume than pre-war levels, while improvements in the energy sector helped stabilize the national grid. Italy, likewise, modernized its manufacturing base, expanding automobile production, rebuilding port infrastructure, and boosting agricultural output. Across Western Europe, electricity production surged, transportation networks expanded, and industries modernized. The growth of trade played a crucial role in sustaining this expansion. As production increased, European nations re-engaged in international commerce. The Marshall Plan actively encouraged trade liberalization, reducing tariffs, coordinating customs, regulations, and promoting freer movement of goods across borders. For the first time, European economies began integrating into a regional market. This integration was strengthened by new multilateral payment systems designed to reduce currency barriers. These reforms laid the groundwork for long-term economic cooperation that would eventually culminate in the formation of the European Economic Community. Meanwhile, the United States gained a powerful advantage. Western Europe became a massive trading partner for American goods. As European economies grew, they imported American machinery, food, raw materials, and manufactured goods. The transatlantic trade network expanded in both directions. This economic interdependence strengthened political ties and made Europe increasingly reliant on American markets, technologies, and investment. The Marshall Plan thus served not only humanitarian and political goals, but also economic interests, creating a mutually reinforcing partnership. The program's technical assistance initiatives continued to feed this growth. Thousands of European specialists traveled to the United States to study fields such as industrial engineering, agriculture, accounting, public administration, and transportation management. They observed American production techniques, labor relations, corporate structures, and scientific research. Upon returning home, they applied these lessons to their own industries. This diffusion of knowledge accelerated modernization across Western Europe. In many respects, the Marshall Plan served as a university for an entire continent, teaching modern management, productivity methods, and industrial planning at a scale unmatched in history. One of the most understated achievements of the Marshall Plan during this period was the restoration of political stability. Stronger economies strengthened democratic governance. Rising employment reduced the appeal of extremist political movements. In France and Italy, where communist parties had significant support during the immediate post-war years, the improved economic climate reduced their influence. Stable democracies became the foundation for long-term alliances with the United States, eventually leading to the formation of NATO in 19. The Marshall Plan and NATO became twin pillars of Western strategy, one economic, one military. The psychological effect of the Marshall Plan continued to matter as much as its material benefits. Europeans who had felt abandoned after the war now saw the United States as a reliable partner. American assistance was not exploitative but empowering. It allowed nations to rebuild on their own terms. This fostered goodwill, trust, and cooperation. It also provided a counterweight to Soviet propaganda. While the USSR emphasized ideological unity, the United States emphasized shared prosperity and mutual benefit. The Marshall Plan became a symbol of democratic strength. However, the plan's influence extended far beyond Europe. By stabilizing Western Europe and reviving global trade, the Marshall Plan strengthened the broader international economy. It supported the development of multilateral institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. These institutions formed the architecture of the post-war economic order. Through them, the United States exercised unprecedented influence, guiding global finance, development, and commerce. The Marshall Plan demonstrated how economic leadership could become a tool of geopolitical power. By the early 1980s, industrial production in Western Europe exceeded pre-war levels. Consumer goods became more available. Wages increased. Cities rebuilt housing, schools, and municipal services. Tourism revived as railways and hotels reopened. France restored the Louvre, Britain reconstructed London's devastated neighborhoods, and Italy rebuilt cultural centers across Florence and Milan. Normal life returned, not gradually, but rapidly. Meanwhile, the Marshall Plan's effect on West Germany was particularly significant. By helping rebuild German industry instead of suppressing it as had been done after World War I, the United States prevented future resentment and ensured Germany became a stable democratic partner. This was a deliberate strategy. American policymakers believed that economic stability was the best defense against extremism. As West Germany recovered, it became a central pillar of Western Europe's economy and a strategic ally in the Cold War. Yet the Marshall Plan was not without its challenges. Some critics argued that it gave the United States too much influence in European affairs. Others claimed that it favored certain industries or countries. But even critics could not deny the results: rising production, falling inflation, stronger democracies, and expanding trade. The scale of success overshadowed any imperfections. By 1951, Europe had changed dramatically. What had been a continent on the brink of collapse had become a region of accelerating growth, modernization, and integration. The Marshall Plan, designed as a temporary program, would soon end, but its effects would continue shaping Europe and the world long after the final shipment arrived. By 1951, Europe had moved far beyond the desperate conditions of the immediate post-war years. The continent was no longer struggling to survive, it was beginning to prosper. The Marshall Plan, nearing its final years, had reshaped Western Europe so profoundly that the region was entering a new phase of growth, known as the post-war economic boom. But the true legacy of the plan lay not only in the prosperity it created, but in the political and strategic alignment it cemented. America had not merely helped Europe recover, it had anchored Europe firmly within a US-led global order. A major turning point during this period was the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, in 1951. Although not formally a part of the Marshall Plan, the ECSC was directly inspired by its emphasis on cooperation. The idea was revolutionary. France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg agreed to pool their coal and steel industries under a common authority. These industries had been the backbone of European warfare for centuries. By integrating them, these nations made future conflict between France and Germany not just unlikely but economically irrational. The ECSC was the first concrete step toward European unity, and its creation was possible largely because the Marshall Plan had fostered cooperation and trust among former rivals. The United States strongly supported European integration. Washington believed that a united Western Europe would be economically stronger, politically stable, and better able to resist Soviet pressure. Integration also created a bloc of prosperous nations that could purchase American goods, participate in global trade, and act as partners in international diplomacy. The Marshall Plan served as the economic foundation for this strategy. While NATO formed in 1914, I served as its military counterpart. Together, these institutions tied Western Europe to the United States in a strategic partnership that shaped the Cold War. Marshall Plan assistance also transformed the social landscape of Western Europe. As economies recovered, governments expanded social welfare programs, improved healthcare systems, and invested in public education. With stable currencies and rising incomes, European citizens gained access to consumer goods that had been scarce for decades. Refrigerators, washing machines, radios, and bicycles became common household items. Cities restored cultural institutions, theaters, museums, libraries, and reopened universities. A sense of normalcy, which had vanished during the war, returned across daily life. The relationship between the Marshall Plan and European political stability was equally important. Democratic governments, especially in France, Italy, and West Germany, grew more secure as living standards improved. Communist parties, which had once seemed poised to win elections in France and Italy, now struggled to attract voters. The United States viewed this political shift as a major strategic victory. American policymakers believed that material security and democratic stability were essential to containing Soviet influence. The Marshall Plan had created the conditions for both, however. The Marshall Plan also forced Europe to confront deeper political and economic questions. Not all nations recovered at the same pace. Britain, despite being a victor in the war, faced chronic economic challenges and struggled more than expected to modernize its industries. France grappled with labor disputes and political turbulence. Italy confronted regional disparities between its industrial north and rural south. West Germany, despite dramatic gains, faced the challenge of integrating millions of refugees from Eastern Europe. These problems were significant, but the Marshall Plan provided the resources and confidence necessary to confront them. American influence in Europe expanded in parallel. U.S. advisors worked closely with European governments, reviewing budgets, recommending reforms, and encouraging trade liberalization. American culture spread as Hollywood films, jazz music, and consumer products arrived in European markets. While some Europeans worried about cultural influence, many embraced American dynamism as a symbol of modernity. The Marshall Plan had created a framework in which American economic, political, and cultural influence could grow. The program also strengthened the U.S. domestically. American industries benefited enormously from producing goods for Europe. Factories that had been operating at wartime capacity now transitioned smoothly into supplying reconstruction, materials tractors, locomotives, machinery, foodstuffs, and medical supplies. Millions of American workers remained employed. The Marshall Plan tied European demand to American production, reinforcing a transatlantic economic partnership that boosted U.S. prosperity. This economic interdependence strengthened political alignment. European nations, reliant on American support for reconstruction and security, joined the United States in forming a unified Western bloc. NATO, the OEEC, and the ECSC collectively formed the backbone of this alliance. The Marshall Plan had done more than rebuild economies. It had constructed the political architecture of the West. Yet not all reactions were positive. The Soviet Union condemned the Marshall Plan as an attempt to create an American sphere of influence. Moscow responded by tightening its control over Eastern Europe, creating the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, as a counterweight. The division between East and West, economic, political, and ideological, became deeper and more permanent. While the Marshall Plan strengthened Western Europe, it also accelerated the fragmentation of Europe into opposing blocs. As Western Europe grew stronger, European nations began to reassert themselves on the global stage. Colonial empires continued to unravel, and European powers struggled with the political and economic demands of decolonization. The Marshall Plan gave them the financial stability needed to navigate these challenges, but it also shifted global leadership toward the United States. which emerged as the central architect of the post-war world order. By 1951, the effects of the Marshall Plan were measurable across every major sector of European life. Industrial output in Western Europe had increased by more than one-third since the program's start. Agricultural production had recovered to pre-war levels. Trade within Europe and across the Atlantic surged. Inflation was under control. Political extremism had declined. Democratic institutions were strengthening. Infrastructure projects from highways to power grids were transforming the physical landscape. The Marshall Plan was scheduled to end in 1952. But Europe was no longer the shattered continent of It had regained stability, confidence, and economic momentum. The next and final phase of this story would show how the Marshall Plan not only rebuilt Europe, but reshaped the global balance of power, ensuring American leadership for decades. By 1952, the Marshall Plan formally came to an end, but its influence did not. The program had lasted only 4 years, yet its impact stretched across decades, shaping the political, economic, and strategic landscape of the modern world. The Europe that emerged from the Marshall Plan was not merely a rebuilt continent, it was a transformed one, firmly aligned with the United States and positioned to become a central pillar of the Western alliance. The achievements of the program reached far beyond reconstruction. They fundamentally redefined global power. The end of the Marshall Plan coincided with the beginning of a broader Western economic surge. Europe entered a long period of sustained growth, at economic miracle in West Germany, the Trente Glorieuses in France, and similar expansions across Italy, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. Industrial output soared. Consumer goods became widely available. Infrastructure projects, highways, ports, airports, and power stations continued to expand. Many of these developments were built on the foundation of stability, confidence, and resources created by the Marshall Plan. One of the plan's most enduring legacies was the institutional architecture it helped establish. The OEEC, created to manage Marshall Plan cooperation, evolved into the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD), which still plays a major role in shaping global economic policy. The European coal and steel community paved the way for deeper economic integration, first with the European Economic Community, later the European Union. What began as an American-led effort to coordinate recovery became the framework for Europe's long-term unity. The political alignment created by the Marshall Plan proved equally important. With stable governments, strong economies, and functioning democracies, Western Europe became a reliable partner for the United States during the Cold War. NATO, created in 19 formed the military shield behind the economic cooperation of the Marshall Plan. This dual-structure economic integration supported by military alliance, an unprecedented level of unity among Western democracies. For the United States, the Marshall Plan delivered enormous strategic benefits. By preventing economic collapse in Western Europe, it halted the spread of Soviet influence without requiring military conflict. It turned former battlefields into prosperous markets for American goods. It created allies capable of sharing the burdens of defense. It secured the United States a leadership position in world affairs. American policymakers had understood that military strength alone could not shape the post-war world. Economic power, combined with diplomacy, was equally essential. The plan also strengthened America's own economy. Factories in the United States continued producing machinery, vehicles, food, and industrial supplies for European reconstruction. Millions of American workers benefited from stable employment during the transition from wartime to peacetime industry. The transatlantic trade network created by the Marshall Plan boosted American agriculture, manufacturing, and transportation sectors. It also reinforced the U.S. dollar's role as the central currency of the global economy. Culturally, the Marshall Plan helped spread American ideas and practices. European managers who trained in the United States brought back new knowledge of mass production, scientific management, customer service, and agricultural modernization. American movies, music, consumer goods, and advertising became symbols of modernity. This cultural influence was not imposed, it was pulled into Europe by the prosperity and openness that the Marshall Plan helped create. The Soviet Union, by contrast, recognized the geopolitical implications of the Marshall Plan and condemned it as an instrument of American dominance. Moscow responded with its own system of economic coordination, Comecon, and intensified political control over Eastern Europe. The Marshall Plan did not create the division between East and West, but it crystallized it, making the ideological and economic lines of the Cold War unmistakable. The Iron Curtain hardened as Western Europe grew stronger under American partnership, while Eastern Europe became more isolated under Soviet rule. Despite these tensions, the Marshall Plan became a model for future international development. Its success demonstrated that large-scale, coordinated economic assistance could stabilize fragile regions, support reconstruction, and prevent political extremism. Later, US policies from development programs in Asia to reconstruction efforts after conflicts drew lessons from the Marshall Plan's emphasis on cooperation, local ownership, and long-term investment. Few programs have had such enduring influence on global policy design. One of the lasting judgments of the Marshall Plan is that it combined moral purpose with strategic clarity. It recognized that humanitarian relief, economic recovery, and geopolitical stability were interconnected. The United States could not isolate itself from global crises. It had to shape the world's future through engagement, investment, and partnership. This principle became a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy for much of the 20th century. Perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the Marshall Plan was that it helped turn former enemies into allies. West Germany, once the center of conflict in Europe, became a core member of the Western Alliance and one of America's closest partners. Italy, devastated by war, became a stable democracy integrated into European institutions. France, long skeptical of Anglo-American intentions, became a leader in shaping Europe's new unity. The reconciliation and cooperation nurtured through the Marshall Plan proved that economic partnership could transcend historical divisions. The program's impact also extended to the social fabric of Europe. Rising employment, improved living standards, and expanded public services restored dignity and hope. Families rebuilt their lives in cities that had once been rubble. Students filled schools rebuilt with counterpart funds. Workers found jobs in industries equipped with modern technology. The sense of despair that haunted Europe in 1945 faded, replaced by optimism for the future. In retrospect, the Marshall Plan stands as one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives ever undertaken by the United States. It rebuilt the continent, strengthened democratic institutions, revived global trade, and established a long-lasting alliance system that shaped the Cold War and the decades that followed. It demonstrated that American leadership, when grounded in cooperation, economic investment, and strategic vision, could transform the world. By helping Europe rise from the ruins of war, the United States secured not only the future of a continent, but also its own place as the leading global power. The Marshall Plan proved that strength could be built not only through armies and weapons, but through hope, opportunity, and shared prosperity. Its legacy remains visible today in the stability, unity, and prosperity of modern Europe and in the enduring partnership between the United States and its allies.